The Battle of Dukla Pass in the autumn of 1944 emerged from a combination of military necessity, political calculations, and the broader trajectory of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. By mid-1944, the Red Army had inflicted decisive defeats on the Wehrmacht in Belarus during Operation Bagration and was pressing steadily westward into Poland, the Baltics, and the Carpathian approaches. In Central Europe, anti-German resistance movements were intensifying, and the Slovak National Uprising, launched on 29 August 1944, threatened to destabilize German control over Slovakia. For the Soviet High Command, supporting this uprising was both a strategic and political imperative. The Carpathian Mountains, and specifically the Dukla Pass on the border of Poland and Slovakia, became the focal point for this effort. From the Soviet perspective, an offensive through the Carpathians could achieve several objectives. Militarily, it offered a direct route into Slovakia and Hungary, threatening the German southern flank and potentially accelerating the collapse of Axis positions in Central Europe. Politically, it aligned with Moscow's intent to extend influence into post-war Czechoslovakia by demonstrating support for the uprising. The First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev was tasked with the operation. The Soviet plan assigned the main effort to the 38th Army, commanded by General Kirill Moskalenko, supported by the Czechoslovak First Army Corps under General Ludvík Svoboda. Their combined force amounted to roughly 160,000 troops, supported by more than 1,600 artillery pieces and mortars, and around 400 tanks and self-propelled guns. German forces anticipated the importance of the Carpathian passes and had fortified them extensively. The responsibility for holding Dukla Pass fell to Army Group Heinrici, part of Army Group A, which deployed elements of the 1st Panzer Army and the Hungarian First Army. The key German formations in the immediate sector included the 97th Jaeger Division, the 1st Mountain Division, and additional infantry and armored units shifted in response to Soviet movements. In total, the German-Hungarian defense counted approximately 100,000 men, 2,000 artillery pieces, and more than 200 tanks and assault guns. Defensive preparations had been underway for months. Minefields, bunkers, and fortified ridges transformed the Carpathian terrain into a natural fortress. The terrain itself was a decisive factor. The Carpathian Mountains offered steep ridges, dense forests, and narrow valleys, which limited maneuverability and gave defenders the advantage. Supply lines were difficult to maintain for both sides. Roads were few and often in poor condition, vulnerable to weather and constant shelling. For the Soviets, advancing heavy artillery and armor through mountain passes proved a monumental task, while for the Germans, retreat routes were constricted, increasing the risk of encirclement if breakthroughs occurred. Intelligence estimates influenced the initial optimism in Moscow. Soviet planners believed that a determined thrust through Dukla Pass could break German resistance in 5 to 7 days, link up with the Slovak insurgents, and secure a foothold in Slovakia. This calculation, however, underestimated both the strength of German defenses and the difficulties imposed by terrain. On the German side, assessments correctly predicted that the Soviets would attempt to exploit the Slovak uprising, and reinforcements were allocated to the region to prevent the insurgency from joining with Soviet forces. Public sentiment in the region added another dimension. For Slovak partisans, the prospect of Soviet support was a source of morale and hope, but the reality of the Carpathian battles was grim. Civilians in the mountain villages were caught between advancing Soviet forces and entrenched German defenders, enduring bombardment, requisitions, and reprisals. For Soviet soldiers, the Dukla operation was presented as a liberation campaign, but morale was tempered by the challenges of mountain warfare and the realization that the offensive would be far more demanding than anticipated. German troops, many of them seasoned mountain infantry, viewed the Carpathians as defensible ground where they could inflict disproportionate losses on the Red Army. Thus, by September 1944, all the conditions for a major confrontation had converged. The Red Army prepared to launch an ambitious assault through one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe, hoping to deliver both military and political results. The Germans, entrenched in fortified positions, stood ready to resist with determination, aware that the fate of their Central European front hinged on the outcome. The stage was set for one of the most grueling battles of the Carpathian campaign, an operation expected to last a week, but which instead consumed nearly 2 months and tens of thousands of lives. The opening phase of the Dukla Pass operation began on 8 September 1944, when the Soviet 38th Army launched its assault across the Polish-Slovak border region. Preceded by a massive artillery barrage, the offensive sought to shatter German forward defenses and create momentum for a breakthrough into Slovakia. More than 1,600 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire along a 20-kilometer front, saturating enemy positions with high explosives and smoke. Within hours, Soviet infantry divisions, supported by tank brigades and self-propelled guns, advanced into the rugged terrain, expecting to exploit gaps and push quickly toward the pass itself. The German defense, however, held firm in unexpected ways. The initial barrage inflicted heavy damage, but failed to eliminate fortified bunkers and machine gun nests embedded in the forested ridges. Units of the 97th Jaeger Division and 1st Mountain Division had spent months preparing defenses, constructing interlocking fields of fire, and laying dense minefields along expected avenues of approach. As Soviet infantry advanced, they encountered withering small arms fire and artillery registered on likely choke points. Soviet tanks attempting to move up narrow valleys became easy targets for concealed anti-tank guns. In the first day alone, the 38th Army suffered more than 3,500 casualties without achieving a decisive breakthrough. Commanders on the ground recognized the scale of the challenge. General Moskalenko, leading the 38th Army, urged persistence, believing that pressure could gradually wear down the defenders. The Czechoslovak 1st Army Corps under General Ludvík Svoboda was committed to the offensive, both as a symbolic gesture of national participation and as a combat unit. These formations, many composed of volunteers and exiles, faced their first major test in the Carpathians. They attacked side by side with Soviet rifle divisions, advancing through forests thick with mines and snipers. Their progress, however, was slow and costly. The German response was coordinated and deliberate. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, overseeing the sector as commander of Army Group Heinrici, had established a layered defensive system. Instead of resisting at the frontier line to the last man, German units withdrew in stages, falling back from one prepared position to another, forcing the Soviets to pay for every ridge and clearing. This elastic defense bought time for reinforcements, including elements of the 8th Panzer Division and Hungarian units, to arrive and plug threatened gaps. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, provided close air support, targeting Soviet artillery concentrations and supply convoys moving through mountain roads. On the Soviet side, frustration mounted as days passed without the expected rapid breakthrough. The plan had envisioned reaching the Slovak insurgents within a week, but already by 10 September progress was measured in kilometers rather than tens of kilometers. Villages such as Dukla itself changed hands multiple times, each engagement leaving behind ruins and mounting civilian casualties. Civilians trapped in these contested areas faced bombardment from both sides, destruction of homes, and forced evacuations by retreating German units. At the strategic level, the Soviet High Command began to adjust its expectations. Marshal Konev pressed Moskalenko to commit more resources, reinforcing the 38th Army with additional artillery regiments and tank units, despite the difficulties of operating armor in mountain terrain. Soviet engineers worked day and night to repair roads, clear mines, and build bridges across streams, enabling supplies to reach forward units. Yet the bottlenecks of the Carpathian valleys slowed every movement, and logistical strain quickly became apparent. For the German defenders, the opening phase confirmed their belief in the defensibility of the Carpathians. Reports from frontline divisions emphasized the heavy losses inflicted on Soviet attackers and the effectiveness of minefields and artillery ambushes. Yet even as they held, German officers recognized the cost. Casualties mounted from constant Soviet pressure, and ammunition resupply became increasingly difficult as Soviet artillery interdicted roads behind the lines. The battle was quickly evolving into one of attrition rather than maneuver. By the end of the first week, the situation was stark. The Red Army had advanced roughly 8 to 10 kilometers into the German defensive zone, far short of the planned objectives. Losses already exceeded 10,000 men, with hundreds of tanks and vehicles damaged or destroyed. German losses, though smaller, were also significant, with entire battalions reduced to half strength. The offensive, initially envisioned as a swift thrust, had turned into a grinding struggle in the mountains, where terrain, weather, and prepared defenses conspired to blunt Soviet firepower. The opening phase revealed that Dukla Pass would not be taken by speed or surprise. Instead, the battle would become a drawn-out contest of endurance, where both sides would commit increasing resources to gain or hold ground measured in meters. What had begun with optimism and urgency was already taking on the character of a prolonged and costly mountain campaign. The strategic goals and planning behind the Dukla Pass offensive evolved significantly in the late summer of 1944 as Soviet and Czechoslovak commanders considered both the military and political context. The Slovak National Uprising, launched on 29 August, provided the immediate trigger. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet High Command saw an opportunity to bring Slovakia into the anti-German coalition and to demonstrate Soviet support for the Czechoslovak government in exile led by Edvard Beneš. A rapid advance through the Carpathians would not only reinforce the insurgents, but also establish a Soviet presence deep in Central Europe before Anglo-American forces could intervene. The Dukla Pass offered the most direct route to link Soviet armies with the Slovak rebels. The initial planning assigned the task to the 1st Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev. Within that front, the 38th Army under General Kirill Moskalenko carried the main burden, supported by the Czechoslovak 1st Army Corps under General Ludvík Svoboda. Together, these forces numbered approximately 160,000 men. The Soviets committed over 400 tanks and self-propelled guns, including T-34-85s and Su-76, along with 1,600 artillery pieces and mortars. Air support was to be provided by elements of the 2nd Air Army, with more than 1,000 aircraft available for bombing and ground attack missions. Logistics became one of the central issues in planning. Supplying a large mechanized force through the Carpathians required careful preparation. Soviet engineers repaired and extended road networks leading into the mountains, while supply depots were established in the rear near Krosno and Sanok. The expectation, however, was that the operation would last no more than a week. Soviet planners estimated that within 7 days, the 38th Army could break through German defenses, cross the Slovak border, and join the insurgents near Banska Bystrica. Based on this projection, supplies were allocated for a rapid advance, rather than a prolonged battle. The German side prepared along very different lines. Army Group Heinrici, which controlled the sector, was acutely aware of the vulnerability of the Carpathian passes. The Wehrmacht anticipated that the Red Army would attempt to exploit the Slovak uprising by forcing a breakthrough. Consequently, they fortified Dukla Pass extensively. The 97th Jaeger Division, 1st Mountain Division, and Hungarian units built defensive belts with minefields, trenches, and bunkers along ridges dominating the valleys. Engineers installed obstacles to block armored vehicles, while artillery was carefully sighted to cover narrow roads and mountain clearings. Reinforcements, including the 8th Panzer Division, were held in reserve to mount counterattacks once Soviet units became overextended. German doctrine stressed the value of elastic defense. Rather than fight to the last man at the border, defenders would withdraw deliberately to successive fortified lines, drawing Soviet forces deeper into terrain that nullified their superiority in armor and numbers. The goal was to inflict maximum casualties while conserving strength for counterblows. Supplies were stockpiled in mountain depots, although German logistics also faced strain. Fuel shortages limited armored mobility, and partisan attacks in Slovakia disrupted rail links bringing reinforcements from Hungary and Austria. Both sides engaged in propaganda to shape morale. Soviet broadcasts highlighted the coming liberation of Slovakia, appealing directly to insurgents and civilians. The presence of the Czechoslovak First Army Corps was emphasized as a symbol of national participation. On the German side, propaganda emphasized loyalty to the Reich and portrayed the Slovak insurgents as traitors manipulated by Moscow. Leaflets and radio messages warned Slovak civilians of reprisals if they supported the uprising. Intelligence played a crucial role in shaping expectations. Soviet reconnaissance indicated that German defenses in the Carpathians were strong, but assumed they could be overcome quickly with massed artillery and armor. Reports from Slovak partisans, who expected Soviet arrival within days, reinforced this belief. In contrast, German intelligence identified Soviet buildups in southeastern Poland and prepared accordingly. The Wehrmacht's experience of fighting in mountainous terrain during previous campaigns gave commanders confidence that they could hold the passes despite being outnumbered. The political dimension influenced Soviet planning heavily. The Kremlin sought not only to defeat German forces but also to assert control over events in Slovakia. By directly aiding the uprising, Moscow would gain leverage over the future Czechoslovak government. This urgency partly explained the optimism of the initial timetable and the decision to commit substantial resources despite the logistical difficulties of mountain warfare. For the insurgents, the expectation of rapid Soviet support shaped their strategy, but it also left them vulnerable when the Red Army became bogged down. Strategically, the Dukla operation reflected the Red Army's transition from defensive to offensive warfare on all fronts. Having advanced hundreds of kilometers in Operation Bagration and in the drive toward the Balkans, Soviet leaders were confident in their ability to sustain momentum. Yet the Carpathians presented unique obstacles. The narrow valleys limited opportunities for armored breakthroughs, while poor weather threatened supply lines. These challenges were noted in planning, but underestimated in their eventual impact. By early September 1944, all plans were in place. The Soviets concentrated forces near Krosno, artillery was registered on German positions, and the Czechoslovak Corps prepared to enter combat. German units completed defensive works and coordinated with Hungarian allies to seal off approaches. Both sides understood the importance of the pass. For the Soviets, it was the gateway to Slovakia and Hungary. For the Germans, it was the barrier preventing Soviet penetration into Central Europe. When the artillery opened fire on 8 September, it marked the execution of plans months in the making. But as the battle unfolded, it would reveal how miscalculations, logistical limits, and the harshness of mountain warfare would transform an intended week-long operation into one of the longest and bloodiest mountain battles of the Second World War. The clash began in earnest during the second week of September 1944, when Soviet and Czechoslovak forces pressed their assault deeper into the fortified zones of Dukla Pass. The opening artillery barrages had torn apart tree lines and destroyed some forward German positions, but the advance quickly slowed. What followed was a series of brutal, localized engagements where every hilltop, ravine, and village became the site of determined combat. The battlefields were small in scale but immense in intensity, with entire regiments expended to capture a ridge only to find a new fortified position looming ahead. In the first days, Soviet rifle divisions launched repeated frontal attacks supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Units such as the 305th Rifle Division and the 183rd Rifle Division were committed to assaults on ridges dominating the approaches to Dukla village. Tanks attempted to move along narrow forest paths, only to be halted by mines and anti-tank ditches. German infantry, often operating in platoon or company-sized strongpoints, made full use of terrain. Concealed positions on reverse slopes allowed them to unleash sudden fire as Soviet troops crested hills. Counterattacks by elements of the 97th Jaeger Division restored positions temporarily lost, inflicting heavy casualties on attackers. One of the most bitterly contested objectives was Hill 534, a height commanding the approaches to Dukla. Soviet troops launched multiple attacks on this hill, each preceded by artillery barrages that churned the ground into mud and craters. German defenders, however, had dug bunkers into the hillside and used pre-registered artillery to shell advancing infantry. Casualty rates climbed steeply. Reports indicated that some Soviet regiments lost up to 30% of their strength in attempts to seize the position. When it finally fell after days of continuous assault, Soviet troops discovered that the Germans had already withdrawn to another fortified ridge further south, preserving the defensive line. Villages along the line of advance were destroyed in the fighting. Dukla itself, lying near the border, became a battlefield where control shifted repeatedly. German artillery fire reduced much of the town to ruins. Soviet engineers attempted to clear paths through minefields to allow vehicles to pass, but each clearance was followed by renewed German fire and countermining operations. Civilians caught in the area endured bombardment and displacement, many fleeing into the forests or being evacuated by advancing Soviet units. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps played a visible role in these engagements. Composed of more than 16,000 troops, it was thrown into the fighting alongside Soviet rifle divisions. For the men of the Corps, many of whom were volunteers eager to liberate their homeland, the experience was harrowing. They faced German defenses as formidable as those encountered by veteran Soviet divisions. The Corps suffered particularly heavy casualties during the attempt to capture Hill 534 and in later battles near the town of Vyshny Komarnik. Nevertheless, their presence was of political significance, symbolizing Czechoslovak participation in the liberation effort and boosting morale among Slovak insurgents awaiting Soviet aid. German defenses relied not only on fortifications, but also on well-coordinated artillery and mortars. Mountain artillery, often deployed in hidden positions, targeted Soviet assembly areas and supply routes. Narrow valleys funneled advancing units into kill zones, where German firepower inflicted devastating losses. Anti-tank guns positioned on slopes dominated roads, knocking out Soviet armor before it could deploy effectively. Reports from Soviet tank brigades described dozens of vehicles disabled or destroyed in a matter of hours, many immobilized by mines, and then finished off by artillery. Despite these setbacks, Soviet and Czechoslovak forces persisted. Marshal Konev pressed Moskalenko to maintain relentless pressure, believing that attrition would eventually wear down the defenders. Reinforcements were committed steadily. Fresh rifle divisions, additional artillery brigades, and tank units were brought forward. Soviet air units attempted to provide close support, but poor weather in the mountains often grounded aircraft or limited their effectiveness. German fighters from nearby airfields, though fewer in number, intercepted Soviet bombers and attacked supply columns, further slowing the offensive. By mid-September, the Soviets had advanced approximately 12 to 15 kilometers into the German defensive zone. Each gain was measured in blood and destruction, casualties on both sides mounted. Soviet reports estimated more than 20,000 casualties by this point, while German divisions, though successful in holding key positions, had also been severely reduced. Entire battalions reported strengths of only a few hundred men. Still, the defensive system remained intact, and the pass itself had not been breached. The morale of troops was strained on both sides. Soviet soldiers, expecting a rapid breakthrough, now faced the grim reality of extended mountain combat. Letters and reports describe exhaustion, constant exposure to artillery fire, and the challenge of advancing in forests filled with corpses and wreckage. German troops, though buoyed by their defensive success, endured relentless shelling and constant pressure. The knowledge that retreat was forbidden by higher command added to their burden, as did shortages of food and ammunition. Unexpected outcomes shaped the early engagements. Soviet planners had underestimated both the natural strength of the Carpathian terrain and the degree of German preparation. What was expected to take days had already stretched into weeks. German commanders, meanwhile, were surprised by the persistence and scale of the Soviet effort, recognizing that the Red Army was willing to pay enormous costs to achieve its political and military objectives. This realization forced them to divert additional units into the sector, weakening other parts of the front, but ensuring that Dukla Pass would not fall easily. By the end of September, the first phase of the clash had demonstrated the nature of the campaign. A grinding battle of attrition in which every ridge and valley had to be fought over repeatedly. The initial engagements revealed that the offensive would not be decided by swift maneuvers, but by endurance, supply, and the capacity of each side to replace its losses. The pass remained in German hands, but Soviet forces had gained a foothold deep within the defensive zone. The fighting had already earned Dukla Pass its reputation as one of the most costly and brutal mountain battles of the war, and the true escalation still lay ahead. As September turned to October 1944, the Dukla Pass offensive entered its most critical stage of escalation. What had begun as an ambitious plan to break through in days had already consumed weeks, and the Red Army now sought to intensify its efforts. Reinforcements were poured into the sector in an attempt to overcome the German defenses. The 38th Army, already heavily engaged, received fresh rifle divisions, additional artillery brigades, and more armor. By late September, more than 250,000 Soviet and Czechoslovak troops were committed, supported by upwards of 1,800 guns and mortars and nearly 500 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Germans also reinforced their positions. Recognizing the strategic importance of the pass, the Wehrmacht shifted elements of the 8th Panzer Division, the 68th Infantry Division, and additional mountain troops into the area. Hungarian units were placed under German operational control to bolster the defensive line. Despite heavy losses, German formations held key ridges and villages, supported by well-placed artillery and Luftwaffe sorties from nearby Slovak airfields. By October, around 120,000 German and Hungarian troops were entrenched in the Carpathians, fighting from prepared positions and natural fortifications. Terrain continued to dictate the tempo of battle. The Carpathian slopes were covered in dense forests and crisscrossed by narrow ravines, making large-scale maneuvers nearly impossible. Soviet armored units could not deploy effectively, often forced to advance along single mountain roads where mines, anti-tank obstacles, and concealed guns awaited them. Infantry carried the burden of the offensive, with regiments storming fortified hills one after another. Artillery barrages softened defenses, but rarely destroyed deeply dug bunkers, and bad weather hampered aerial support. The fighting became a relentless cycle of assaults, counterattacks, and attrition. One of the fiercest battles of this phase occurred at Hill 532 and Hill 534, where repeated Soviet attacks clashed with equally determined German resistance. These heights dominated approaches to the pass and were defended by machine gun nests, mine belts, and overlapping artillery fire. Soviet troops stormed them repeatedly, suffering enormous casualties. In some regiments, losses reached 50% within a week. German defenders endured equally heavy bombardments, with entire positions obliterated by shellfire before being retaken in close combat. The hills changed hands several times, leaving the slopes littered with wreckage and unburied dead. Civilian suffering escalated alongside the military struggle. Villages such as Dukla, Iula, and Vyshny Kamarnik were almost entirely destroyed in the crossfire. Residents fled into forests or were forcibly evacuated. German troops executed suspected collaborators, while Soviet artillery indiscriminately leveled settlements used as defensive positions. Food shortages spread, and reports described starving families hiding in cellars or caves as the battle raged above them. The local population, already traumatized by years of occupation, now endured one of the bloodiest mountain campaigns of the war. Command difficulties compounded the crisis. Soviet commanders, under pressure from Stavka, pressed forward despite mounting casualties. Marshal Konev ordered continued assaults, unwilling to admit that the timetable had been unrealistic. General Moskalenko, on the ground, sought to rotate exhausted divisions but lacked sufficient fresh units. Coordination between Soviet and Czechoslovak forces was strained by communication problems and the inexperience of the Czechoslovak Corps in large-scale offensive operations. German command also faced challenges. Divisions were understrength, supply lines were harassed by Slovak partisans, and constant Soviet pressure left little opportunity for rest. Weather added further complications. Heavy autumn rains turned mountain roads into mud, delaying supply convoys and immobilizing vehicles. Artillery pieces became bogged down, and ammunition shortages emerged on both sides. Soviet attempts to bring up fuel and shells were slowed by destroyed bridges and German shelling of supply routes. For the Germans, dwindling stocks of fuel restricted the mobility of their panzer units, reducing their ability to counterattack effectively. Despite the obstacles, the battle continued to escalate. Soviet reinforcements included the 1st Guards Army, brought forward to add weight to the assault. These elite formations attempted to outflank German positions through the forests, suffering heavy losses in minefields and ambushes. The Czechoslovak 1st Army Corps, though depleted, remained engaged, sustaining over 6,500 casualties in September and October alone. German divisions also reached breaking points. Reports from the 97th Jaeger Division indicated battalions reduced to fewer than 300 men. Political tensions mounted as the Slovak uprising faltered. The insurgents, expecting Soviet support within days, faced growing German countermeasures without relief. The prolonged struggle at Dukla meant that Soviet forces never reached them in time. German reprisals in Slovakia intensified, with thousands of civilians executed and villages burned. The failure to link up with the insurgents represented a major political blow to the Soviet plan, undermining its credibility among anti-German resistance movements. By early October, casualties on both sides were catastrophic. Soviet and Czechoslovak forces had lost an estimated 70,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, along with more than 300 tanks and hundreds of artillery pieces damaged or destroyed. German and Hungarian losses, though somewhat smaller, exceeded 20,000, with many formations rendered combat ineffective. The battle showed no sign of abating, as each ridge captured by the Soviets revealed yet another fortified line behind it. The escalation phase of the Dukla Pass battle transformed the offensive into a war of attrition. Neither side could achieve rapid success, and both were trapped in a costly struggle dictated by geography and political urgency. For the Soviets, the price of progress was immense, but retreat was politically impossible. For the Germans, holding the line drained manpower needed elsewhere, but prevented a Soviet breakthrough into Slovakia at a critical moment. By October, the Carpathians had become a battlefield of endurance, where attrition replaced maneuver, and the slaughter on the mountain slopes reached its grim peak. By the second half of October 1944, the Dukla Pass operation reached its peak intensity. The initial Soviet timetable, which had projected a 7-day breakthrough, was long forgotten. Instead, both sides were locked in a continuous struggle marked by some of the most intense mountain fighting of the Eastern Front. The Red Army concentrated unprecedented amounts of artillery on narrow sectors, attempting to smash through German defenses that seemed to regenerate after each barrage. At the same time, the Wehrmacht and its Hungarian allies threw every available unit into holding the ridges and valleys, aware that the fall of the pass would expose Slovakia and Hungary to Soviet advance. Major operations centered on a series of fortified hills and villages that controlled the road south. Hill 534 and Hill 532 became symbols of the campaign, each captured and recaptured multiple times at staggering cost. Soviet rifle divisions attacked in waves, supported by tanks inching forward on mud-choked tracks. German defenders, often reduced to companies or platoons, counterattacked with local reserves, retaking lost ground in night assaults or under cover of artillery fire. Each shift in control left the slopes littered with wrecked vehicles and heavy casualties. In the lowlands near Dukla village, fighting reached its most destructive scale. Entire regiments clashed in close combat among ruined houses and shattered orchards. Soviet engineers tried to clear paths through minefields to allow armored thrusts, only for German gunners to destroy tanks as they entered narrow lanes. Casualties in some Soviet regiments exceeded half their strength within days. German divisions, meanwhile, reported companies reduced to fewer than 60 men, yet still holding key points through stubborn resistance and constant artillery support. Air operations intensified during this phase. The Second Air Army flew hundreds of sorties daily, striking German artillery and troop concentrations. Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft targeted supply convoys and defensive strongpoints, while Yak fighters attempted to secure air superiority. The Luftwaffe responded with fighter bombers from Slovak airfields, intercepting Soviet formations and bombing advancing columns. Air duels over the mountains added another layer of destruction, but poor weather often grounded aircraft and limited their effectiveness. The toll on civilians deepened further. Villages along the front line were systematically destroyed. German units employed scorched earth tactics, burning settlements suspected of harboring partisans or aiding Soviet troops. Soviet bombardments leveled others inadvertently. Families hiding in forests or cellars faced starvation, disease, and exposure. Those caught by German troops during retreats were often deported or executed as reprisal measures. The population of the Carpathian borderlands became another casualty of the prolonged campaign. High command decisions reflected the desperation of the moment. Marshal Konev ordered continued assaults despite the mounting losses, unwilling to concede failure in front of both Stalin and the Czechoslovak allies. The First Guards Army was thrown into the fighting, attempting to flank German positions through dense forests. German commanders, including Field Marshal Schörner, demanded that every ridge be defended to the last, forbidding withdrawals except when absolutely necessary. This rigid stance trapped German divisions in defensive battles they could ill afford, but it also slowed the Soviet advance to a crawl. By late October, Soviet forces had advanced roughly 20 kilometers beyond their starting positions, but at immense cost. More than 80,000 Soviet and Czechoslovak casualties had been recorded, with hundreds of tanks and vehicles lost in terrain ill-suited for mechanized warfare. German and Hungarian losses were also severe, estimated at over 25,000 men, but their defensive system remained functional. The pass itself was not yet fully secured, and the Red Army found itself locked in a battle of attrition in which progress was measured in meters. The peak of the campaign underscored the transformation of the Dukla operation from a rapid breakthrough into one of the most grinding mountain battles of the war. Both armies poured men and materiel into the narrow front, while political pressure ensured that neither side could retreat without orders. The result was an unprecedented slaughter in the Carpathians, where the landscape itself became a fortress, and the cost of each ridge was measured in thousands of lives. As the fighting dragged into November 1944, both sides sought ways to adapt to the brutal conditions around Dukla Pass. The Red Army, facing weeks of heavy casualties with little territorial gain, began to modify its tactics. Instead of relying on large frontal assaults, commanders increasingly employed infiltration by smaller infantry groups supported by concentrated artillery fire. Reconnaissance units probed for weak spots in the German defenses, often advancing at night through forests and ravines. Engineers worked constantly to clear mines and open new paths for vehicles, though progress was still painfully slow. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps, badly depleted but determined, remained in the line. General Ludvík Svoboda reorganized his battered divisions, integrating replacements and reassigning surviving veterans to critical roles. Despite shortages of equipment and heavy losses, more than a third of the corps by this stage, the Czechoslovak troops continued to fight alongside Soviet divisions. Their presence carried symbolic weight, demonstrating to Slovak insurgents and the wider population that liberation forces were committed, even if delayed. On the German side, resistance also adapted. With manpower dwindling, the Wehrmacht increasingly relied on flexible defensive tactics. Small units fortified isolated strongpoints, forcing the Soviets to commit disproportionate resources to eliminate them. Mortar and artillery fire, coordinated by forward observers hidden in forested slopes, inflicted steady attrition. The use of camouflage and deception allowed German positions to survive heavy bombardments. To conserve strength, counterattacks were localized and launched only when essential to regain vital terrain. Partisan activity in the Slovak hinterland further complicated the situation. Local resistance fighters attacked German supply lines and ambushed convoys on mountain roads, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops to rear area security. The uprising itself, however, was faltering under German pressure. Without a rapid Soviet breakthrough, the insurgents in central Slovakia were isolated. German reprisals escalated. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and thousands of civilians were executed or deported. For the insurgents, the long-awaited Soviet relief remained out of reach, a failure that demoralized resistance fighters and strained relations with Moscow. Logistical improvisation defined the Soviet effort. Supply convoys struggled along destroyed roads, and fuel shortages limited tank operations. To maintain artillery bombardments, shells were hauled by hand or on horse-drawn carts when trucks could not pass. Mobile field hospitals treated thousands of wounded under primitive conditions, with many soldiers evacuated through makeshift trails. German logistics were equally strained, as constant Soviet shelling and partisan attacks disrupted deliveries. Ammunition and fuel shortages left some units unable to mount effective counterblows, but the defensive advantage of terrain allowed them to endure. Psychological strain grew steadily. Soviet soldiers wrote of advancing through forests filled with wreckage and corpses, where every hill concealed another ambush. German troops described unending bombardments, the roar of Soviet artillery echoing through the valleys day and night. Letters and diaries captured exhaustion, fear, and resignation. Civilians trapped in the war zone experienced the collapse of daily life, surviving in ruins or forests while armies clashed around them. Despite these hardships, both sides demonstrated remarkable resilience. Soviet units rotated to the front after brief rest periods, replenished by replacements from the rear. German formations, though reduced to fragments of their original strength, continued to resist fiercely. Each adaptation, the Soviets' shift toward infiltration and concentrated artillery, the Germans' reliance on small fortified groups, prolonged the battle without altering its fundamental nature. By mid-November, the Red Army had secured several key ridges and villages, inching closer to the Slovak border. Yet progress remained slow, and the cost continued to climb. The adaptation of both sides ensured that the Dukla Pass campaign would not end quickly, but instead descend further into a grinding war of attrition, testing the endurance of armies and civilians alike in the harsh environment of the Carpathian Mountains. By late November 1944, the long and grinding battle for Dukla Pass reached a critical turning point. After nearly 3 months of combat, the Red Army finally forced a path through the German defensive belts. This breakthrough, however, came not as the result of a single decisive strike, but through relentless attrition that gradually wore down the defenders. The fighting around the heights of 534, 532, and the approaches to Svidnik had drained both sides to exhaustion, leaving German units too depleted to maintain a continuous line. The Soviet 38th Army, reinforced by elements of the 1st Guards Army, delivered the decisive pressure. Massed artillery barrages pounded German positions for hours, destroying bunkers and severing communication lines. When Soviet rifle divisions advanced, they found defenders reduced to small groups with limited ammunition. German companies that had once numbered 150 men often fielded fewer than 40 by this stage. Counterattacks, once a hallmark of the defense, became rare and short-lived. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps played a significant role in this final push. Despite having lost over 6,500 men since the beginning of the operation, its soldiers continued to advance alongside Soviet units. In late November, they fought through minefields and entrenched positions to capture the village of Vyshny Komarnik, one of the first Slovak settlements liberated by the offensive. The moment carried symbolic weight. After years of occupation, Czechoslovak troops stood on their own soil, though at terrible cost. The breakthrough was not dramatic. Soviet advances were measured in kilometers, achieved only after weeks of sustained combat. When German positions finally collapsed, it was the cumulative effect of relentless pressure rather than a sudden collapse of morale. German command, under Field Marshal Schörner, ordered local withdrawals to secondary defensive lines in Slovakia, but these retreats were slow and costly. Mountain roads clogged with wrecked vehicles and abandoned equipment testified to the strain. The repercussions for civilians were immediate. Slovak villages on the southern side of the pass were devastated by artillery fire and bombardment. Thousands fled, while others were caught in reprisals as German forces withdrew. In towns like Svidnik, liberation was accompanied by scenes of destruction, burned houses, destroyed infrastructure, and survivors struggling to find shelter in winter conditions. The Red Army established temporary administrations distributing food where possible, but shortages persisted. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. Soviet troops, exhausted by weeks of fruitless assaults, experienced relief at finally crossing into Slovak territory, though the sense of victory was muted by the scale of losses. For German soldiers, the retreat through the Carpathians marked a recognition that their positions in Central Europe were no longer secure. Army Group Heinrici had fought skillfully, but it could not prevent the gradual erosion of its strength under Soviet pressure. Strategically, the breakthrough failed to achieve its original objective. The Red Army had intended to link up swiftly with the Slovak national uprising, but the delay proved fatal. By the time Soviet troops entered Slovakia, the uprising had been crushed. German forces had executed thousands of insurgents and civilians, and partisan groups were scattered into the mountains. What had been planned as a liberation in coordination with local resistance now became a conventional military advance into devastated territory. The turning point at Dukla Pass thus carried a paradoxical meaning. Militarily, it represented a Soviet victory, opening a path into Slovakia and Hungary. Politically, it underscored a failure, the inability to support the uprising in time. Casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that Soviet and Czechoslovak losses exceeded 85,000 men, while German and Hungarian forces suffered at least 20,000. The battlefield itself bore the scars of this attrition, with forests leveled by artillery, hills scarred with trenches, and villages reduced to rubble. By early December, the Red Army had established control over the pass and pushed into eastern Slovakia. Yet the costs of reaching this point meant that momentum slowed and further operations required regrouping. The turning point had been achieved, but at such a price that both armies emerged weakened. The Dukla Pass offensive had demonstrated the extreme demands of mountain warfare and marked one of the bloodiest passages in the liberation of Central Europe. The aftermath of the Dukla Pass offensive revealed the devastating toll of 2.5 months of continuous combat in the Carpathians. By December 1944, the fighting gradually subsided as Soviet units consolidated positions in eastern Slovakia, while German forces withdrew to secondary defensive lines deeper in the mountains. What had begun as a bold plan to break through in a week had cost nearly 3 months and produced catastrophic losses on both sides. For the Red Army and the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, the immediate consequences were staggering. Estimates place Soviet and Czechoslovak casualties at more than 85,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Hundreds of tanks, self-propelled guns, and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned on mountain roads. Entire divisions were rendered ineffective. Some rifle regiments that had started the campaign with 2,000 men ended it with fewer than 500. Medical services were overwhelmed, evacuating thousands of wounded under appalling conditions along muddy, shell-torn roads. The offensive technically succeeded in opening the pass, but the forces that accomplished it were so depleted that further exploitation into central Slovakia slowed to a crawl. German and Hungarian forces also suffered heavily. Estimates suggest losses of around 20,000–25,000 men, many in the form of attrition spread across multiple divisions. Units such as the 97th Jaeger Division and 1st Mountain Division reported battalions reduced to company strength. Nevertheless, the German command considered the battle a partial success. Though compelled to withdraw, they had delayed the Soviet timetable long enough to crush the Slovak uprising and stabilize their defenses in Hungary. The Wehrmacht also managed to extract significant numbers of troops and equipment, retreating in good order despite constant Soviet artillery fire and partisan harassment. The devastation of the battlefield extended beyond the armies. Civilian communities around Dukla, Svidnik, and Vyshny Komarnik were left in ruins. Dozens of villages were destroyed by artillery fire or deliberately burned during German withdrawals. Thousands of inhabitants had fled into forests or been deported by German forces during the fighting. Survivors returned to find homes leveled and farmland unusable, forcing many into temporary shelters during one of the harshest winters of the war. Famine and disease spread in the months that followed, compounding the suffering. Reprisals and humanitarian crises accompanied the end of combat. In areas retaken by the Red Army, mass graves were uncovered, containing executed partisans and civilians accused of aiding the insurgency. German forces retreating through Slovakia carried out further retaliations, burning villages such as Ostry-Grün and Klak and killing hundreds of residents. The Red Army, for its part, requisitioned food and housing for its troops, adding to local hardship. Civilians thus bore the brunt of devastation from both occupiers and liberators. For the Slovak insurgents, the delayed Soviet advance was disastrous. By the time Soviet and Czechoslovak forces secured Dukla Pass, the Slovak national uprising had already been crushed. German reprisals had executed thousands of fighters, and partisan groups were scattered into the mountains with limited supplies. The failure to link up in time left the uprising isolated, marking one of the great disappointments of the campaign. Politically, this failure deepened Soviet control over post-war narratives, as Moscow emphasized the role of the Red Army rather than the insurgents in the liberation of Czechoslovakia. The military consequences were immediate. The Red Army now had a route into Slovakia and eventually Hungary, but its forces required weeks of reorganization before resuming offensive operations. The exhaustion and depletion of the 38th Army and the Czechoslovak Corps limited their ability to exploit the breach. German forces, though weakened, retained the capacity to delay Soviet advances through continued defense in depth. The next major Soviet operations in the region would not resume until late 1944 and early 1945, when pressure on multiple fronts stretched German defenses further. The Dukla Pass campaign thus ended in a state of mutual exhaustion. The Soviets had technically achieved their objective, but at a cost that undermined their operational effectiveness. The Germans had lost the pass but succeeded in buying valuable time. For civilians and insurgents, the consequences were catastrophic: destroyed villages, mass executions, and the collapse of the uprising. The immediate legacy of the battle was one of devastation, marking the Carpathian Mountains as a graveyard for tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians alike. The legacy of the Battle of Dukla Pass 1944 lies in its dual identity: a tactical Soviet victory that opened a gateway into Slovakia, and at the same time a strategic and political failure that revealed the extreme costs of mountain warfare and the limits of coordination with resistance movements. In the broader context of the Eastern Front, Dukla was one of the bloodiest operations of its kind, earning the reputation of the Carpathian Stalingrad for the sheer number of casualties inflicted in a relatively narrow sector. Yet it is also remembered as a campaign overshadowed by larger offensives of the same period, such as the Vistula-Oder advance and the battles in Hungary. Militarily, Dukla highlighted the ability of the Red Army to sustain large-scale operations in some of the most difficult terrain of Europe. The employment of hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of tanks in the Carpathians demonstrated logistical capability and determination. However, the cost was staggering. More than 85,000 Soviet and Czechoslovak casualties, including over 6,500 from the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, against approximately 25,000 German and Hungarian losses. The offensive achieved its territorial aim, but the drain on manpower and resources was disproportionate. For German commanders, the campaign confirmed that properly prepared defensive positions in mountains could delay superior forces for weeks, even months, though at the cost of irreplaceable casualties. Politically, the offensive failed to fulfill its most important secondary objective, aiding the Slovak national uprising. The uprising was crushed before Soviet forces broke through the Carpathians, leaving tens of thousands of Slovak fighters and civilians exposed to German reprisals. This outcome undermined the credibility of Soviet promises of immediate support, but it also allowed Moscow to control the narrative of Czechoslovakia's liberation. In post-war years, The contribution of the Slovak insurgents was downplayed in official Soviet accounts, while the Red Army's role at Dukla was elevated as the decisive event leading to liberation. For Czechoslovakia, the memory of Dukla became central to post-war commemoration. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps, despite its losses, was celebrated as a symbol of national resistance. Monuments were erected at Dukla and Svidnik, and the battlefield was transformed into a site of remembrance. Annual ceremonies honored both Soviet and Czechoslovak soldiers who had fallen, embedding the operation into the broader narrative of anti-fascist struggle. For survivors, however, the memory was grim. Veterans spoke of endless assaults up wooded slopes, entire units wiped out, and the suffering of civilians caught in the line of fire. In Germany, the battle was remembered less prominently. Wehrmacht reports acknowledged the effectiveness of the defense, but emphasized the attrition suffered by their mountain and infantry divisions. For many German soldiers, Dukla represented one of the last major efforts to hold Central Europe, a delaying battle fought under increasingly desperate circumstances. In military studies after the war, it served as a case study in the defensive use of terrain, but it held little public resonance compared to other campaigns. Historically, Dukla Pass is significant for demonstrating the intersection of military operations and political objectives in late-war Europe. It revealed how Stalin's determination to project Soviet influence into Central Europe shaped operational decisions, sometimes at the expense of efficiency. It also underscored the vulnerability of resistance movements when dependent on external support that could be delayed by battlefield realities. Today, historians continue to debate the meaning of Dukla. Was it a necessary step in the liberation of Czechoslovakia, or a costly diversion shaped by political considerations? Did the sacrifice of tens of thousands of soldiers accelerate the collapse of German defenses in Slovakia and Hungary, or could the same outcome have been achieved with less bloodshed? These questions reflect the broader ambiguities of the Eastern Front, where victories often came at enormous human cost. The Battle of Dukla Pass thus remains both a symbol and a warning. It was the gateway through which Soviet and Czechoslovak troops re-entered Slovakia, but it was also the grave of tens of thousands. Its significance lies not only in the ground gained, but in the lessons it left about the price of strategy, the brutality of mountain warfare, and the tragic gulf between political ambition and military reality.